to all the women here, I say, please take care of yourselves first.
Hi, Cecile Watson here. Welcome to Ladies Speaking. I am your host, and today it is my pleasure to share with you this replay of an empowering conversation with our January Sister in Spotlight, Barbadian Dr. Juliet Daniel. Juliet now lives in Canada, and she's a professor, cancer biologist, and discoverer of the Kaiso cancer gene. Ladies Speaking episode number 3 begins right now. It is brought to you by the kind courtesy of Shaw Medical Travel Consultants. Okay, so over the last 4 decades, I have been working my way up in the private sector and in the public sector. And I have discovered through having to apply resilience, audacity, and persistence, how important it is to have a community around you who can help support you as you grow and change. Now, when I said 4 decades, so you know that that's a while back. And when I look back at myself 40 years ago and I looked up, there weren't many women around, far less Caribbean women. And that's what Ladies Speaking is all about. It's about bringing us together as women of the Caribbean to facilitate empowerment of ladies through inspiring conversations that encourage confidence. I am sure that I would have been able to go faster and further had I had the support of women just as yourselves at that time in my life. Today, things have changed. Women have managed to make their way up in the corporate ladder. Women have managed to start their businesses and have been able to make them work. And we all know that when women progress, their families make progress. And when their families make progress, communities progress and nations progress. So we're hoping that through this forum, we've started a movement that really facilitates that change. We have here with us today, our sister in spotlight is Dr. Juliet Daniel. I don't know if protocols say we call you Dr. since you're a professor, but you can correct me. Juliet is a Barbadian, and she's doing this amazing work as a professor and a cancer biologist. Tell us, Juliet, what causes this young Barbadian girl to dream this grandiose dream that takes her to a place where she is the discoverer of a gene related to breast cancer?
Well, okay. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for inviting me, Cecile, to participate in your Ladies Speaking forum. And thanks to everyone for spending a hopefully lazy Sunday afternoon watching and listening to this. So I would say what brought me here. So I grew up, as you mentioned, I was born and raised in Culloden Road, St. Michael, for those of you that are Barbadian. Some of you may know my dad. He was a cabinet maker who made antique style furniture out of mahogany. And pretty much, as I said, my brother and I reflect and think we were the original child laborers, because we had to help cane the furniture with our tiny little fingers back in the day. But so back then, of course, we didn't have all the technology we have now. And I was a complete bookworm. I loved everything science and anything to do with the natural world. So I read prolifically as a kid. And when I sat my 11+ exams, I got into Queen's College, and yeah, and so I was always fascinated, as I said, by nature. How do things work? And I was one of those kids that always asked why. But I was also quite good at writing, and at least I thought I was good at English and comprehension. But apparently, one of the teachers at Queen's College did not like my very creative interpretations of Shakespeare. And so, and so when they started giving me C's for my creative interpretations of Shakespeare and telling me that that's not what Shakespeare meant, and I would argue and say, well, how do you know what Shakespeare meant? You weren't there and neither was I. So, and the question said, what do you think he meant? And I told you what I thought he meant. Anyway, so because I was obviously going to get into a rather vicious circle of arguments with this particular teacher, I decided to focus on the sciences because E is always MC squared and 1 + 1 is always 2. And there's not going to be a debate about whether I deserved an A or an A+. So I pretty much focused on that for the rest of my time at QC. And again, because no one in my family had at that time, I think, gone to university. So I didn't have anyone to really guide and counsel me. Again, there was no internet back then. And so everyone is like, oh, you're so good at math and physics, you should become a doctor, which now I think back makes zero sense whatsoever, because I wasn't even taking biology. I hated blood and anything squirmy and stuff. So, but everyone's like, oh, if you're good at math and physics, you should be a doctor. But I knew that I was more interested in research. But again, I didn't have anyone to guide me or tell me that you could actually do research without becoming a physician. So when my parents said that they were willing to send me overseas because they'd been saving and saving and scrounging every penny, I thought, okay, this is a chance to go and explore the world and see what else I could do with my talents. And so again, pre-internet, so I applied to Ontario universities and to McGill. But in Ontario, Queen's University was amazing. They would send these manila envelopes every 2 weeks with the Queen's logo. And it got to the point where we anticipated the envelope every 2 weeks, because every 2 weeks, an envelope would come with something really cool in it about Queens. It would be, oh, here's the local newspaper. Oh, here's some photos of Kingston, or here's what the dorms look like. And if you, as I said, this was pre-internet, we had no money for me to travel or my family to travel and visit all the Canadian universities. So we were pretty much going, relying on the various universities to let us know what their institutions were like. So when the time came to make a decision, my family and it was a pretty easy one. The only one I knew was Queen's, because they're the only ones that communicated with me on a regular basis and really tried to make me feel like I was already there as a student long before I accepted. And so unfortunately, that year was the year that most of the students in my cohort did horribly in chemistry, because our teacher was brilliant at Queen's College, but he was not able to communicate his knowledge to the rest of us.
That sounds like the chemistry teacher I had.
Pardon?
Before you, so
it might be the same one you had. I don't know. You never know. And by the time people realized that this was a problem, all of my friends, we started taking chemistry lessons, but it was too late. And so I was one of those unfortunate people that basically, I think I got 2 A's. I got an A in physics and an A in math and an E in chemistry. And I think there were 30 of us that did chemistry that year, and 5 of us passed with an E, and the rest all failed. It was horrible. So yeah, our cohort didn't do too good for national scholarships and awards that year. But anyway, so I went to Queen's, spent, had a blast there. And it was at Queen's that I realized you could do a PhD. You didn't have to go to med school. And since, as I said, I wasn't really that keen on blood and gore. And then also in my case, unfortunately, my next door neighbor in Barbados and my mom were both diagnosed with cancer within months of each other. Well, actually, my neighbor died in October of 1987. And then my mom was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in November that year, and then passed away in May of 1986, and then passed away in May of 1987. And so I definitely didn't want to even see the inside of a hospital at that point in time. And I also felt that the doctors weren't able to do anything to save my mom or my neighbor, but maybe if there had been more research on ovarian cancer or cancer in general, maybe there would have been drugs. And so maybe that's where I should focus my energies, was more on the finding therapies to prevent and cure these diseases rather than just giving the patient and their family the bad news of, oh, you've got cancer and there's not much I can do for you.
So you
So
were at college at that point in time when you
Queen's
came.
University, Queen's University,
Yeah,
Queen's University. Yeah. So I was always wearing my royal Queen's crown, you know,
yeah. Yes.
Queen's all the way. Yeah. So then but as I said, my parents had wanted me to go to med school and my entire family, because no one had gone to university before or even become a doctor. So they were still kind of pushing that. When my mom died, as I said, I really wasn't keen on it, but I had applied anyway. And I moved so I actually got accepted at UBC for grad school. And again, in the absence of internet, just packed up and moved because it was the warmest place in Canada and the novelty of snow and cold in Ontario had completely worn off. And I heard it was the warmest place and beautiful because of the mountains. So I just applied, got accepted and moved. And then about a week before classes officially began, I got a phone call from University of Toronto telling me that, oh, you've been accepted to med school and you need to make a decision now because we're going to go onto the waiting list and start calling students who are on the waiting list. And I was like, can I defer it? My mom just died a few months ago. I just moved to Vancouver. The thought of packing up and moving without even settling in. I hadn't even been in Vancouver a month. And the lady, it was a secretary, and she said, no, I have to make a decision. And that's probably the only regret I have in my life, is that I didn't insist on speaking to someone in a higher position of authority. But, you know, I was 22, you know, in a new city by myself, still grieving for my mom. And so I told her, fine, just give it to the next person on the list. I've always wanted to know who was that next person on the waiting list that got into med school and what are they doing now? I hope they used it. I hope they became an amazing doctor, you know? Yeah.
But were you able to tap into any other resources at that time to help guide you to say, that's a big decision to make? I mean,
she wasn't giving me the opportunity to even wait a day. Seriously, it was literally, she gave me no, as I said, that was my only regret, I would say, in life, is that I didn't have that maturity or wisdom to know that I should have requested to speak to someone. But also 30 something years ago, I don't know if there was such a thing as accommodations. Like now we make accommodations for students who are grieving or have some other, you know, health issue or something. And a situation like mine today they definitely would have probably given me a deferral, you know, but 30 something years ago, she was not even like, she didn't even seem to understand my rationale for needing to think about it. You know, she was like, it was kind of like, U of T Medical School is one of the most prestigious schools in the country, and you're waffling about whether you want to come to med school here. You know, I think that was her kind of attitude, that I should be thrilled to get in and I should accept, and she can't believe I'm waffling about it. So, yeah.
For you, but you were able to make your way. That's
yeah.
persistent.
And I like to tell my undergrad students that, because I think many students as well think that professors are professors because we didn't get into med school or we weren't smart enough for med school. So I like to tell a lot of my students this story so that they know, no, many of us choose to be researchers, because without a researcher, every single doctor can do nothing. Like, you would be able to do nothing. All the drugs that are developed, as we see now with COVID, they're being developed by researchers. Yeah. Right? It's not the physicians that are developing them, it's the researchers.
So that's a very important point, because we have a tendency to play down the roles other people play because we think they're not as important as what we do.
Exactly.
But, I made the point last episode about the neck that turns the head.
Exactly.
And, I mean, we can't all be the same, and we need not be the same, because it's when we all come together that things happen, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. So that was, I guess, how I ended up in Vancouver. And then after my PhD, I was still in search of warmer weather. I realized that I really was, Bajan at heart and loved my beach and the warmth. And so I interviewed a few places for my postdoctoral fellowship. And the one opportunity that I decided on was the one in Memphis, Tennessee, of all places. The city wasn't, culturally the best place to go, but it was professionally the best choice. And that's also something I tell my students, is that you have to recognize when things are short-term or a stepping stone to something bigger. I saw it as a stepping stone to something bigger. It was not a place that I was going to live permanently, but I saw it as an opportunity to actually make a discovery and be a first, because the lab I was joining was a relatively new lab. He had made a recent discovery himself. So there was just lots of things to do in his lab, whereas the other two labs that I was very interested in, as well as the cities they were in, London, England, and San Francisco. I love both of those cities and would love to have lived there, but those projects were flooded with people around the world working on those projects. And so it would have been a lot more competitive and difficult to make any kind of significant discovery in either of those two labs. So I had to, so then I did the very mature thing and chose a postdoctoral fellowship based on, future potential rather than the excitement of the city itself. But I'm so glad I went to Memphis because it was a real eye opener. I learned a lot about being Black because in Canada, it was a lot of subtle, it wasn't, being Black wasn't such a big thing back then, I guess, or I don't know. But living in Memphis and the Deep South for 6 years was incredibly enlightening. I learned a lot. That's where I learned about a lot. I guess I would say I learned about a lot of the Black authors and literature and the art. And so for me, it was enriching that way, even though it's not a place that, my family didn't want me to go. No one wanted me to go. And as I shared in my story at the Perimeter Institute, the bank wouldn't even let me open a bank account when I first moved there because the racism there was so entrenched. They just couldn't understand why a Black person would move to Memphis. So that was, it was an eye opener for me, but it really gave me a lot of insight into the struggles of the Blacks, African Americans that live and work in the US, because I couldn't understand that as someone coming from the Caribbean where we had Black prime ministers, Black lawyers, Black doctors. Like it was, I grew up thinking, yeah, I could be anything I want to be. Dame or headmistress at Queen's College said, yes, I'm preparing you girls to be the future leaders of tomorrow. And when I think about it, I was discussing this with my friend recently and I thought, we were crazy. We were really we drank her Kool-Aid and we really believed that we could be anything we wanted to be.
Yeah.
But, in hindsight, I'm like, we were from a little island of 250,000 people in an all-girls school with less than 500 people. And we really believed that we could be anything we wanted to be in this world. Like we drank her Kool-Aid, we totally drank her Kool-Aid.
And we're doing it.
And we're doing it.
And we're doing it.
And we're doing it. So, but in hindsight, you kind of think that was crazy, right? Like that was so crazy. So yeah, so that's how I ended up in Memphis. And that's where I cloned and discovered Kaiso. My supervisor said I could name the gene anything I wanted. And once I asked him 3 times to make sure he really meant that. And once he said yes, because he regretted naming his protein that he discovered, he named his gene just after the molecular weight, which is P120. So it was protein, molecular weight 120. And he regretted just giving it that boring name. And so once he said I knew that I wanted to name it something to honor my Caribbean roots and heritage, because by that point, I had already realized there were not many Black people in science in North America or the world. And so I knew that I wanted to leave a little Caribbean flavor in science. So that's how I came up with Kaiso, because I love Calypso. And I pretty much played soca every night when I was working late in the lab. So it was just natural that I had to name it Kaiso. So yeah.
So are there other Caribbean people who have done like you have and discovered cancer genes?
They probably are. I haven't really gone looking or anything, but there probably are 1 or 2 people that have also discovered. There are lots of Caribbean people and African people, not just Caribbean. There are a lot of people making different types of discoveries. Yes. So there's one of my friends in Toronto, he has a traveling museum that's called the African Inventors Museum. And basically he showcases every invention made by a Black person globally. And it's actually a very extensive mobile museum. And now he also has a website where he has all of these folks featured. So you can always so for Black History Month, it's there all the time, but you can go and actually see the different inventions. And he has everything, starting with Elijah McCoy, who invented, some little bolt or something that kept trains running, which is why everyone says the real McCoy, because it's named after the little gadget or whatever that Elijah McCoy invented. So there's lots and lots of Black inventions. It's just that we don't get the credit, I guess, that we deserve, but that's okay.
So tell me though, what led you to actually focus on the triple negative breast cancer gene?
So about 10 years ago, so I've had my lab now for 21 years. And for the first 10 years, we were busy just characterizing Kaiso, trying to understand, well, what does this gene do in normal cells? Because that's typically how we understand what it does in any kind of disease, whether it's cancer or Alzheimer's or whatever, is you try to study the gene first in normal cells. And then you look to see, well, what happens when I, break the gene in two, or I remove a few genes, DNA sequences or proteins to understand what happens in disease. And so the first 10 years, we were really focused on understanding Kaiso's basic function in normal cells. And then in 2008, I went to a conference, and it was at that conference I heard Dr. Lisa Newman talking about triple negative breast cancer and its prevalence in Black women. And she was doing research with women in Ghana, West Africa. And I remember thinking, what? That's crazy, like a cancer that's most prevalent in Black women. And I immediately wondered whether or not there was a high incidence in the Caribbean and Barbados as well. And since my goal was always, as I said, to get a Nobel Prize and to do things to help the Caribbean and to come back to the Caribbean and retire, I thought, well, for my next research leave, I'll go to Barbados and I'll look and start studying triple negative breast cancer in the Caribbean to see whether there was also a high prevalence here and whether or not women were dying disproportionately from triple negative in Barbados. So I saw her, as I said, I saw her at a conference in 2008, and my next research leave was in 2010, 11. And so I started preparing. I reached out to doctors and physicians here in Barbados to establish collaborations so that when my research leave came up in 2011, I was able to come here and start the project. So we've been working on it now. Wow, 10 years this year. Yeah, so that's pretty much how it started. And because I had literally taken this retirement course, and that was part of my retirement plan, that I would do breast cancer research here in the winter and then go back to Canada after the winter. So it's part of my retirement plan. It was what I call a win-win situation.
Right, yeah. Right. So as you went through that process and you saw yourself getting closer to a solution, describe that for us.
Solution for triple negative breast cancer, you mean? Yeah. So the first few years were tough. One of my friends that I had met actually as a postdoctoral fellow when I was at St. Jude in Memphis, when I met him, he was a research scientist at Yale University. So he was an MD, PhD. And so when I first came to Barbados in 2011 to start the project, I emailed him and said, can we have a Skype call? Because I want to do this project, but I'm not a physician. I don't fully understand this, but I know you do this technique called tissue microarray where you put you put hundreds of pieces of tumors from hundreds of women on one block so you can screen them quickly. And so I told him I wanted to talk to him about it, whether he would collaborate, and thus in the collaboration, maybe even pay for it because I didn't have the money to do it. And so we had that call, and he was honestly the person that gave me the confidence to carry on, because he was immediately ecstatic about it and said, yes, yes, yes. Oh my God. Because in the US, they didn't have at that time, 10 years ago, they didn't have a lot of tissues from Black women with triple negative breast cancer. And so he said, if I could get tumors from triple negative breast cancer patients in the Caribbean, that would be like a gold mine for all researchers studying triple negative breast cancer, because they all knew that it was prevalent in Black women, but they didn't have access to a lot of the Black women in the US because of historical issues, obviously. And so he and I actually wrote several grants in 2012 and 13 to get the project funded, but we always literally came like this close and then never got funded. And we couldn't understand why. And in hindsight, we think there was some politics going on and a little bit of male chauvinism and some other stuff. But because I'm very persistent, I kept applying. And one of the years that it was rejected, the Canadian reviewer, when I sent it to a Canadian agency, said, this project is not relevant to the Canadian context, which blew my mind away, because I was like, well, we have Black people here. What do you mean this isn't relevant to the Canadian context? So that was quite disheartening, but I just kept applying and applying. And then the third try to that particular agency, the Canadian Breast Cancer Foundation, is when I got funded, and we were ranked number 2 out of all 70 grants that were submitted.
To the
So,
same agency.
same agency.
No.
Took me 3 tries, because I don't give up that easily, but we got it funded. So that's pretty much, so that is that. The project then took off in 2015, because up until then I literally had no money to do that project. And it's really hard to do research if you're not funded. And sometimes you're funded, but for different projects. So at the time I had funding for a colon cancer project, but I didn't have funding to pursue this breast cancer project. So we were working on it kind of like in the background, and like, you know, taking a little bit of money here and there from my colon cancer project, but I didn't have dedicated funds to do this. So in 2015 was when the research really took off. And then that's when I also got introduced to Leila Springer from the Olive Branch of Hope, who was on the call, I believe. And yeah, we've been pretty much running with it ever since.
Yes.
And we just got funded. So yeah, so we got funded 2015 to 2018, was unable to renew it 2019. Or I had to try 4 times, excuse me, to get it renewed. And then we just got it funded in August this year. And again, after 4 attempts over 2 years with really ridiculous reviews, this time it was ranked number 1 on the panel. So that was very exciting, because I've never been ranked number 1 on a panel. So I was like, yay. Now we've got funding for 5 more years to really push the project forward, which is great. So, but it's been a challenge, and it's not just for me, the National Institutes of Health in the US, because of, as I said, there needs to be a statue of George Floyd, to be honest, because it's interesting how his death has galvanized every single organization to re-examine what they're doing and what they have done that has contributed to anti-Black racism. And so I think that because of that, many agencies are, you know, now, I wouldn't say they're willing to admit, but they realize that they have been complicit in a lot of anti-Black racism, the lack of success of many, many Black individuals, male and female. And the National Institutes of Health, which is the major funding agency in the US for all health-related grants and research, they did a study that found that most biomedical research conducted by a Black or racialized scientist focused on Black or racialized communities were the least funded projects in the US. Like in the past 30 years.
Right.
Right. And so that means that a lot of the research on chronic diseases that, you know, specifically affect Black, Hispanic, and other racial populations have been pretty much not done or done well in the past 30 years, because that type of research is typically done by people in those communities. And we haven't been funded because most of the peer review committees are, what should I say, stacked with you know, the majority privileged group. So yeah, it's been a struggle, but as I said, I don't give up easily. So many of my friends kept saying, stop writing your grant, just focus on something else, switch projects. But I couldn't do that.
You keep saying that, and you keep breezing over it, right?
Breezing over what?
The fact that you don't give up easily.
Oh yeah.
Yet, that is why you have achieved what you have achieved, right?
Yeah, probably, yeah.
Usually what causes many of us not to achieve what we know in our heart of hearts we are meant to manifest, right?
Right. True.
What
I guess
that causes you not to give up easily?
I have no idea. For me, I think there's also, as you said, there's that inner gut feeling as well that this is what you're supposed to do. Right. And then I have a strong faith in God, and I pray about things a lot, and I ask for signs and indications that I should stop this or whatever. And yeah, so I think it's hard to articulate, I think.
Yeah.
And in a case like this, when it was something that was disproportionately affecting Black women through no fault of their own, I just felt like, and no one was studying it. Literally, when we wrote that first grant in 2012, 2013, no one was studying triple negative breast cancer in Black women in Canada. And Leila can attest to this. Like, no one was studying it. And so, you know, to say that this wasn't relevant to the Canadian context when Black women were dying disproportionately was such an insult, you know?
You imagine if you
So,
given up?
pardon me?
Can you imagine if you had given up?
Yeah, exactly. No one in Canada would be studying it. All the research would be done in the US, which is where most of it's been done. It would continue being done in the US, but not in Canada and definitely not in the Caribbean. Now there are lots of people interested in this in the Caribbean. And the other interesting thing, which I guess I didn't point out so far, is that, you know, what was interesting, as I said, like I started this because of the hearing Dr. Lisa Newman speak. And then what was really cool was when we suddenly were able to merge our Kaiso research with our triple negative research, when we discovered that Kaiso was highly expressed in triple negative breast cancer. And which was therefore, we think, contributing to the aggressiveness of triple negative breast cancer. So one of the projects we want to do is to see if maybe we can develop a drug that targets Kaiso. And if in the targeting of Kaiso, we can actually prevent the tumor from spreading, then that would be like so amazing kind of, you know, discovery as well.
So
So
what
that's one of the things we want to do.
so what do you need to make that happen?
I need some passionate, committed graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, research funding, and lots of prayers in God.
Well, ladies, you hear that? I can offer prayer. I'm not going to fit. I'm not going to fit any other categories there. But we have some women here on the lines, and I know some are in the medical profession as well.
Yeah.
And hear your story will no doubt move them to understand, you know, what important work you are doing. I know at least one lady on the line who has had her both breasts removed because of having found that gene in herself. And I know it is very important work that you're doing, Juliet.
Yeah.
So looking back over your term in terms of growing into this role that you are now, you've had some failures along the way, no doubt.
Of course, science is 95% failure.
Yeah, and failures, and not talking just on the science side, but in your personal life as well. I know you are a breast cancer survivor, is it?
Yes. Yeah.
How did it feel for you when you're working on this particular gene, and then, or did it happen at the same time?
So actually, yeah, so I was diagnosed a year after I heard Dr. Newman's talk, actually. And the crazy thing was, it was one of these, so like, as I said, my mom died of ovarian cancer. So my family doctor and I were quite diligent about, you know, making sure I got my yearly exams, because ovarian cancer is sometimes linked to breast cancer in many women. And so when I was a graduate student, I actually had a lot of fibrocystic breast. So I was diagnosed with fibrocystic breast disease, which is the lumpy, bumpy breast. And I would get the cyst every, you know, whenever I had a menstrual cycle, my breast would sometimes really swell and expand. And I'd have these giant cysts in my breast that were incredibly painful. So I was diagnosed with that in graduate school. And I remember asking the doctor whether that in any way would increase my risk for breast cancer. And at the time, they were like, no, we don't think so. No one's studying that. And to this day, I think no one's really studying whether fibrocystic breast increase your risk of breast cancer. Because again, ironically, fibrocystic breast disease is something that's very prevalent in Black women. So there could be a connection, but I'm not sure that is being well studied to see if there's a link, because that would be very useful to study as well. So my family doctor in Hamilton and I were always super diligent about checking my breast every year. And, you know, she would do a pelvic ultrasound to make sure that my ovaries were okay. And I remember October 2008, went for my physical, everything was fine. And then the December, like 2.5 months later, I lay down to go to bed and I felt a lump. And I'm like, this is crazy. I just had a checkup 2 months ago. And so I immediately called her. I was literally flying to Barbados like 2 days later to come for Christmas. And so obviously I couldn't get a test or a biopsy done before I traveled. And so so that was probably a very stressful vacation in Barbados, because it was nagging me and worrying me the entire time I was here. But then when I got back, she scheduled me for a biopsy. And as fate would have it, the biopsy was scheduled the day of Barack Obama's inauguration. So I will never forget that day. So I went for the biopsy and then, you know, drove as fast as I could to the first Black church in Hamilton they were having a big screen party of this and everything. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is so surreal. My breasts have just been poked to death. They were sore. There were bandages all over my breasts. And I'm here watching the first Black president being inaugurated. It was the most surreal, bizarre day of my life. And it was just weird. It was like, but at the same time, I almost knew that it was going to be positive if it makes sense. It was this weird feeling that this is a stupid cancer. And so when my doctor called 2 weeks later, I was like, from the minute I saw her face, I knew. And, because she and I have a very unusual and special relationship that most of my friends envy. Like, she's very honest and blunt because she knows I'm a scientist. And so we always talk professionally, but also as intellectuals. And she started crying because she knows that we had been so diligent about my health, and she couldn't understand either how I could go from seeing her in October to then having this lump 2.5 months later, so she was completely devastated, and she pretty much did everything in her power to make sure I got the best care after that. Like, even now, if I call her with a headache, she's like, come in, I'm checking you. Like, she's just making sure that she says that I'm around to harass her for a long time. So yeah, so that was very surreal. That was incredibly surreal. And my approach to many, like any, I guess, horrible diagnosis or problem is I pretty much go from 0 to 100 quickly. So the day I was diagnosed, I went from diagnosis all the way through the surgery, the chemo, the planning my funeral, everything in like 2 hours. And then once I got it out my system, then I went home and started calling all my friends to figure out, okay, how are we going to do this now? But I had to I went through this whole process in like 2 hours from the minute she told me. And then I was like, okay, now how do I live and survive and beat this? And then, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it was crazy. The cancer survivors on here can all relate, I'm sure. Yeah.
Quite a story, right? What do you do when you're scared, Juliet?
Pray, man. Pray.
Pray, man. Never fails, right? Run to the rock for rescue.
Yeah.
Yeah. I cannot close off without mentioning our sponsor, Shaw Medical Travel Consultants, Judy Shaw. She's on the line this afternoon. Thank you very much, Judy, for stepping up and enabling this event to come off this afternoon. We appreciate it. So with that, Juliet, the last word to you.
Oh. Oh boy. Last word. I guess one of the things that my friends and I say and do, and we've all seen, is basically like when you're in a room with other women, and especially if there's mansplaining going on, just make sure that you're your authentic self, and that you amplify the voices of other women around you, because that's something that sometimes doesn't happen. And because everyone, and remember, everyone has a struggle. So that's something that my students are struggling with. They're losing their patience with many others right now. And I have to keep reminding my students that everyone has a struggle. And just because they don't know what that struggle is, doesn't mean that that person is being lazy or whatever. We don't know what that person's home situation is. Maybe it's 7 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment. Maybe they've got a sibling with a disability. And so I'm having to do what I call social work with my students. So one of my little COVID, I should say, quotes is to be just, be kind, be safe, and be well, because we don't know what everyone is going through. We can't assume. And so just be just, be kind, be safe, and be well. So I'll end it with that.
That is a perfect way to end this evening.
Yeah.
Be just, be kind, be safe, be well.
Yeah.
And that's my call to all of you here this afternoon. Thank you for showing up. Love you. Hope to see you next week. So now, before
next month.
Next month, second Sunday of the month at 4 p.m. EST. Now that happens to be Valentine's Day.
We'll be in lockdown.
Huh?
We'll be in lockdown still.
and we're still going to have this show. I'm going to have Simone Bow, who is from Bahamas, and she runs a program called Men Speak, which is a monthly program. And I'm sure she's going to bring a message about loving ourselves more. So Simone has a very interesting story coming out of a bad marriage and having to find her way back to having feeling like she has worth. And she shares that openly, and I'm so happy that she will be here next month to do that. You don't have to be born here to be a part of this forum. Caribbean connections work. I think it's Joe who says she's not from the Caribbean, but she's a friend of the Caribbean, right, Joe?
Heart and soul.
Correct. So therefore, you don't have to be from the Caribbean. We welcome you. As long as you love the Caribbean and you love what we are doing here, you're most welcome. So ladies, just be kind, be safe.
Yeah.
What's the last one?
Be well.
Be well. I can't read my writing. Okay, great. Bye now. Have a good week.
Okay. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thanks, Cecile.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Dr.
to the
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
excellent
It
conversation.
was wonderful.